Christmas Honeymoon by Howard Spring. We were married on December 22nd, because we had met on the 21st. It was as sudden as that. I had come down from Manchester to London. Londoners like you to say that you come up to London, but we Manchester people don't give a hoot what Londoners like. We know that we, and the likes of us, lay the eggs, and the Londoners merely scramble them. That gives us a sense of superiority. Perhaps I have this sense unduly. Certainly I should never have imagined that I would marry a London girl. As a bachelor, I had survived 30 Manchester summers, and it seemed unlikely to me that if I couldn't find a girl to suit me in the north, I should find one in London. I am an architect, and that doesn't make me love London any the more. Every time I come down to the place, I find it has eaten another chunk of its own beauty, so as to make more room for the fascias of multiple shops. All this is just to show you that I didn't come to London looking for a bride, and if I had been looking for a bride, the last place I would have investigated would be a cocktail party. But it was at a cocktail party in the Magnifico that I met Ruth Hutton. I had never been to a cocktail party in my life before. We don't go in much for that sort of thing in Manchester, scooping a lot of people together and getting rid of the whole bang shoot in one do. It seems to us ungracious. We like to have a few friends in and give them a cut off the joint and something decent to drink and talk in a civilised fashion while we're at it. That's what we understand by hospitality. But these cocktail parties are just a frantic St. Vitus gesture by people who don't want to be bothered. I shouldn't have been at this party at all, if it hadn't been for Claude Tunstall. It was about 6:30 when I turned from the lunatic illumination of Piccadilly Circus, which is my idea of how hell is lit up, and started to walk down the Haymarket. I was wondering, in an absent-minded sort of way, how long the old red pillars of the Haymarket Theatre would be allowed to stand before some bright lad thought what fun it would be to tear them down, when Claude turned round from reading one of the yellow playbills, and there we were, grinning and shaking hands. Claude had something to grin about, because the author's name on the playbill was his. It was his first play, and it looked as though it wouldn't matter to Claude, so far as money went, if it were his last. The thing had been running for over a year. Companies were touring it in the provinces and colonies, and it was due to open in New York in the coming year. No wonder Claude was grinning, but I think a spot of the grin was really meant for me. He was the same old Claude who had attended the Manchester Grammar School with me and shared my knowledge of its smell of new exercise books and old suet pudding. Claude was on his way to this party at the Magnifico, and he said I must come with him. That's how these things are. There's no sense in them. But there would have been no sense either in trying to withstand Claude Tunstall's blue eyes and fair tumbling hair and general look of a sky over a cornfield. That's going some for me, and perhaps the figure is a bit mixed, but I'm not one for figures at any time. Anyway, it explains why, 5 minutes later, I was gritting my teeth in the presence of great boobies, looking like outsizes in 18th century footmen, yelling names and looking down their noses. We stood at the door of a room and I was aware of the gold blurs of chandeliers and a few dozen apparent football scrums and a hot blast of talk coming out and smacking our faces. So I deduced this was the party all right. One of the boobies yelled, "Mr. Claude Tunstall and Mr. Edward Oldham." And from what happened, it might just as well have been the Archangel Gabriel and one worm. Because the moment we were over the threshold, all the scrums loosened up and girls descended on Claude like a cloud of bright, skittering, squawking parakeets, flashing their red nails at him, unveiling their pearly portals in wide grins, and bearing him off towards a bar where a chap in white was working overtime among all the sweet accessories of sin. I never saw him again. Well, as I say, I might have been a worm, no use at all to parakeets, but that lets in the sparrows. I was just turning slowly on my own axis, so to speak, in the space that was miraculously cleared round me, when I saw a girl looking at me with an appreciative gleam in her brown eyes. She was the brownest girl I ever saw. Eyes, skin and hair, homely as a sparrow, and just as alert. As our eyes met, there came, fluting out of one of the scrums, a high-pitched female voice. "No, Basil, I'm teetotal, but I can go quite a long way on passion fruit." The pronunciation of that passion was indescribable. It seemed the bogus essence of the whole damn silly occasion, and the brown girl and I, looking into one another's eyes, twinkled, savouring together the supreme idiocy. Instinctively we moved towards one another, the twinkle widening to a smile, and I found myself getting dangerously full of similes again, for when she smiled, the teeth in her brown face were like the milky kernel of a brown nut. We sat together on a couch at the deserted end of the room, and I said, Let me get you something to drink. What would you like? Though, whatever it is, it would taste nicer in civilised surroundings." "I agree," she said simply. "Come on." And so, 10 minutes after I had entered the Magnifico, I was outside again, buttoning my overcoat warmly about me, and this girl was at my side. It was incredible. This is not the sort of thing I usually do, but it had happened so spontaneously, and to be out there in the street with a little cold wind blowing about us was such a relief after that gaudy bedlam that the girl and I turned to one another and smiled again. I could see she was feeling the same about it as I was. Our eyes were towards the dazzle of Piccadilly Circus when she turned and said, "Not that way." So we went the other way, and down those steps where the Duke of York's column towers up into the sky, and then we were in the park. To be walking there, with that little wind and the sky full of stars huddling together in the cold, and the bare branches of the trees standing up against the violet pulsing of the night. This was indescribable, incredible, coming within a few minutes upon that screeching aviary. Ruth Hutton was a typist, nothing more. Her father had been one of those old fogies who rootle for years and years in the British Museum to prove that Ben Jonson had really inserted a semicolon where the 1739 edition or whatnot has a full stop. Things like that. Somehow he had lived on it, like a patient old rat living on scraps of forgotten and unimportant meat. Ruth had lived with him, just lived, full of admiration for the old boy's scholarship, typing his annual volume, which usually failed to earn the publisher's advance. When he died, the typewriter was all she had, and now she typed other people's books. She had been typing a long, flaming novel about Cornwall by Gregoria Gunson, and Gregoria, whom I had never heard of before, but who seemed a decent wench, had said, "I'll take you along to a party. You'll meet a lot of people there. Perhaps I can fix up some work for you." So there Ruth Hutton was at the Magnifico, feeling as much out of it as I did, and as glad to escape. She told me all this as we walked through the half-darkness of the park, and I, as naturally, told her all about myself. She was hard up, but I had never known anyone so happy. And I don't mean gay, bubbling, effervescent, no. You can keep that for the Magnifico. I mean something deep, fundamental, something that takes courage when you're as near the limit as Ruth was. To this day, I don't know London as well as Londoners think everyone ought to know the place. I don't know where we had supper, but it was in a quiet place that everybody else seemed to have forgotten. There was a fire burning and a shaded lamp on the table. The food was good and simple, and no one seemed to care how long we stayed. I wanted to stay a long time. I had a feeling that once Ruth got outside the door, shook hands, and said good night, I should be groping in a very dark place. I crumbled a bit of bread on the table, and without looking at her, I said, "Ruth, I like you. I've Never liked anyone so much in my life. Will you marry me? She didn't answer until I looked up, and when our glances met, she said, yes, if you and I can't be happy together, no two people on earth ever could. Well, this was 5 years ago. We have had time to discover that we didn't make a mistake. We were married at a registry office the next morning. The taxi driver, who looked like one of the 7 million exiled Russian princes, and the office charwoman, who had a goiter and a hacking cough, were the witnesses. I tipped them half a sovereign each. I cling to these practical details because I find them comforting in view of the mad impracticality of what was to follow. Please remember that I am an unromantic northerner who couldn't invent a tale to save his life. And if I tried to do so, I should at once begin to try and fill it with this and that. In short, with something. The remarkable thing about what happened to me and Ruth was simply that nothing happened. If you have never come up against nothing, you have no idea how it can scare you out of your wits. When I was a child, I used to be afraid of something in the dark. I know now that the most fearful thing about the dark is that we may find nothing in it. It was Ruth's idea that we should spend the few days of our honeymoon walking in Cornwall. Everything was arranged in a mad hurry. Not that there was much to arrange. We bought rucksacks, stuffed a change of underclothing into them, bought serviceable shoes and waterproofs, and we were ready to start. Walking was the idea of both of us. This was another bond. You could keep all the motor cars in the world so far as we were concerned, and all the radio and daily newspapers too, and we both liked walking in winter as much as in summer. Cornwall was Ruth's idea. She had Cornwall on the brain. Her father had done some learned stuff on Mallory, and her head was full of Merlin and Tintagel and the return of Arthur. Gregoria Gunson's novel helped too, with its smugglers and romantic inns and the everlasting beat of surf on granite coasts. So, Cornwall it was, a place in which neither of us had set foot before. We made our first contact with Cornwall at Truro. Night had long since fallen when we arrived there on our wedding day. I have not been there since, nor do I wish ever to return. Looking back on what happened, it seems appropriate that the adventure should have begun in Truro. There is in some towns something inimical, irreconcilable. I felt it there. As soon as we stepped out of the station, I wished we were back in the warm, lighted train, which already was pulling out on its way to Penzance. There was no taxi in sight. To our right, the road ran slightly uphill. To our left, downhill. We knew nothing of the town, and we went to the left. Soon we were walking on granite. There was granite everywhere, grey, hard and immemorial. The whole town seemed to be hewn out of granite. The streets were paved with it, enormous slabs like the lids of ancestral vaults. It gave me the feeling of walking in an endless graveyard, and the place was silent enough to maintain the illusion. The streets were lit with grim economy. Hardly a window had a light, and when, here and there, we passed a public house, it was wrapped in a pall of decorum, which made me wonder whether Cornishmen put on shrouds when they went in for a pint. It did not take us long to get to the heart of the place. The few shopping streets that were a bit more festive, gay with seasonable things, and when we found an hotel, it was a good one. I signed the book, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Oldham, Manchester, and that made me smile. After all, it was something to smile about. At this time last night, Ruth and I had just met, and now Mr. and Mrs. Edward Oldham. Ruth had moved across to a fire in the lounge. She had an arm along the mantelpiece. a toe meditatively tapping the fender. She looked up when I approached her and saw the smile, but her face did not catch the contagion. "Don't you hate this town?" she asked. "I can put up with it," I said, "now that I'm in here, and now that you're in here with me." "Yes," she answered. "This is all right. But those streets, they gave me the creeps. I felt as if every stone had been hewn out of a cliff that the Atlantic had battered for 1,000 years and plastered with wrecks. Have you ever seen Tewkesbury Abbey?" The irrelevant question took me aback. "No," I said. "I've never seen stone so saturated with sunlight," said Ruth. "It looks as if you could wring summers out of it. The fields about it I know have run with blood, but it's a happy place all the same. This place isn't happy. It's under a cold enchantment." "Not inside these four walls," I said, "because they enclose you and me and our supper and bed." We fled from Truro the next morning. Fled is the word. As soon as breakfast was over, we slung our rucksacks onto our backs and cleared out of the granite town as fast as our legs would take us. December 23rd, and utterly unseasonable weather. The sky was blue, the sun was warm, and the Christmas decorations in the shops had a farcical and inappropriate look, but we were not being bluffed by these appearances. We put that town behind us before its hoodoo could reimpose itself upon our spirits. And soon there was nothing wrong with our spirits at all. We were travelling westward, and every step sunk us deeper into a warm enchantment. Ruth had spoken last night of a cold enchantment. Well, this was a warm enchantment. I hadn't guessed that, with Christmas only 2 days ahead, any part of England could be like this. We walked through woods of evergreens and saw the sky shining like incredible blue lace through the branches overhead. We found violets blooming in warm hedge bottoms, and in a cottage garden a few daffodils were ready to burst their sheaths. We could see the yellow staining the taut green. We had tea at that cottage, out of doors. I thought of Manchester, and the fog blanketing Albert Square, and the great red trams going through it slowly, like galleons clanging their warning bells. I laughed aloud at the incredible, the absurd things that could happen to a man in England. One day Manchester, the next London, the next marriage, Truro, and the cold shudders. The next this. I said all this to Ruth, who was brushing crumbs off the table to feed the birds that hopped tamely round her feet. "It makes me wonder what miracle is in store for tomorrow," I said. "And anyway, what is Cornwall? I've always thought it was beetling cliffs and raging seas, smugglers, wreckers, and excisemen." We entered the cottage to pay the old woman, and I went close up to the wall to examine a picture hanging there. It was a fine bit of photography, spray breaking on wicked-looking rocks. "That's the Manacles," the old girl said. "That's where my husband was drowned." The Manacles? That was a pretty fierce name, and it looked a pretty fierce place. The woman seemed to take it for granted. She made no further comment. "Goodbye, my dear," she said to Ruth. "Have a good day." We did, but I never quite recaptured the exaltation of the morning. I felt that this couldn't last, that the spirit which had first made itself felt in the hard grey streets of Truro had pounced again out of that hard grey name. The Manacles. It sounded like a gritting of gigantic teeth. We were being played with. This interlude in fairyland, where May basked in December, was something to lure us on, to bring us within striking reach of... Well, of what? "Isn't this England?" I said to myself. "Isn't Cornwall as well within the four walls of Britain as Lancashire?" We breasted a hill, and a wide estuary lay before us, shining under the evening sun. Beyond it, climbing in tier upon tier of streets, was Falmouth. I liked the look of it. "This is where we stay tonight," I said to Ruth. "We shall be comfortable here." A ferry took us across the harbour. Out on the water it was cold. Ruth pointed past the docks, past Pendennis Castle, standing on the hill. "Out there is the way to Land's End," she said. I looked. Low down on the water there was a faint grey smudge. Even a Manchester man would know that that was fog, creeping in from the Atlantic. All night long we heard the foghorns moaning, and it was very cold. I hate sleeping in an airless room, and by midnight the white coils of fog, filling every crevice, and cold as if they were the exhalation of icebergs, made me rise from bed and shut the window. Our bedroom hung literally over the sea. The wall of the room was a deep bay, and I had seen how, by leaning out of the window, one could drop a stone to the beach below. Now I could not see the beach. I could not see anything. If I had stretched my arm out into the night, the fingers would have been invisible. But though I could not see, I could hear. The tide had risen, and I could hear the plash of little waves down there below me. It was so gentle a sound that it made me shudder. It was like the voice of a soft-spoken villain. The true voice of the sea and of the night was that long, incessant bellow of the foghorns. The shutting of the window did nothing to keep that out. I drew the curtains across the window, and turning, saw that a fire was laid in the grate. I put a match to it. Incredible comfort. In 10 minutes we felt happier. In 20, we were asleep. There seemed nothing abnormal about Falmouth when we woke in the morning. A fairly stiff wind had sprung up. The fog was torn to pieces. It hung here and there in dirty, isolated patches, but these were being quickly swept away. There was a run on the water. It was choppy and restless, and the sky was a ragbag of fluttering black and grey. Just a normal winter day by the seaside. A marvellous day for walking, Ruth said. At the breakfast table we spread out the map and considered the day's journey. This was going to be something new again. There had been the grey inhospitality of Truro, the Arcadian interlude, the first contact with something vast and menacing. Now, looking at the map, we saw that, going westward, following the coast, we should come to what we had both understood Cornwall to be, a sparsely populated land, moors, a rock-bound coast. It promised to be something big and hard and lonely, and that was what we wanted. We put sandwiches into our rucksacks, intending to eat lunch out of doors. We reckoned we should find some sort of inn for the night. A bus took us the best part of 10 miles on our westward journey. Then it struck inland to the right. We left it at that point, climbed a stile, walked through a few winter bare fields, and came to a path running with the line of the coast. Now indeed we had found traditional Cornwall. Here, if anywhere, was the enchanted land of Merlin and of Arthur, the land that Ruth dreamed about. Never had I found elsewhere in England a sense so overpowering both of size and loneliness. To our left was the sea. Down there at the foot of the mighty cliffs along whose crest we walked. The tide was low, and the reefs were uncovered. In every shape of fantastic cruelty they thrust out towards the water, great knives and swords of granite that would hack through any keel, tables of granite on which the stoutest ship would pound to pieces, jaws of granite that would seize and grind and not let go. Beyond and between these prone monsters was the innocent yellow sand, and looking at the two, the sand and the reefs, I thought of the gentle lapping of the water under my window last night, and the crying of the foghorns, the most desolate crying in the world. Southward and westward the water stretched without limit, and inland, as we walked steadily forward all through the morning, was now a patch of cultivation, Now the winter stretch of rusty moor, with gulls and lapwings joining their lamentations as they glided and drooped across it, according to their kind. From time to time, a cluster of trees broke the monotony of the inland view, and I remember rooks fussing among the bare boughs. Rooks, lapwings and gulls. Those were the only birds we saw that day. It was at about 1 o'clock that we came to a spot where the cliff path made a loop inland to avoid a deep fissure into which we peered. In some cataclysm, the rocks here had been torn away, tumbling and piling till they made a rough giant stairway, down which we clambered to the beach below. We ended up in a cove so narrow that I could have thrown a stone across it, and paved with sand of an unbelievable golden purity. The sun came through the clouds, falling right upon that spot. It was tiny, paradisal, with the advancing tide full of green and blue and purple lights. We sat on the sand, leaned against the bottommost of the fallen granite blocks, and ate our lunch. We were content. This was the loveliest thing we had found yet. Ruth recalled a phrase from the novel she had typed for Miss Gregoria Gunson. And you'll find here and there a paradise 10 yards wide, a little space of warmth and colour, set like a jewel in the hard iron of that coast. Far-fetched, I thought, but true enough. It was while we were sitting there, calculating how long that bit of sun could last, that Ruth said, "We wanted a lonely place, and we found it, my love. Has it struck you that we haven't seen a human being since we got off the bus?" It hadn't, and it didn't seem to me a matter of concern. I stretched my arms lazily towards the sun. "Who wants to see human beings?" I demanded. I had enough human beings at the Magnifico to last me a very long time. "So long as we find some human beings to make us a bit of supper tonight." "Never fear," I said. "We'll do that. There. Going, going, gone." The sun went in. We packed up, climbed to the cliff top, and started off again. At 3 o'clock, the light began to go out of the day. This was Christmas Eve, remember? We were among the shortest days of the year. It was now that a little uneasiness began to take hold of me. Still, I noticed, we had seen no man or woman, and though I kept a sharp lookout on the country and land, we saw no house, not a barn, not a shed. We did not see the sun again that day, but we witnessed his dying magnificence. Huge spears of light fanned down out of the sky and struck in glittering points upon the water far off. Then the clouds turned into a crumble and smother of dusky red, as though a city were burning beyond the edge of the world. And when all this began to fade to grey ashes, I knew that I was very uneasy indeed. Ruth said, "I think we ought to leave this cliff path. We ought to strike inland and find a road. Any road." I thought so too, but inland now was nothing but moor. Goodness knows, I thought, where we shall land if we embark on that. "Let us keep on," I said, "for a little while. We may find a path branching off. Then we'll know we're getting somewhere." We walked for another mile, and then Ruth stopped. We were on the brink of another of those deep fissures like the one we had descended for lunch. Again the path made a swift right-hand curve. I knew what Ruth was thinking before she said it. "In half an hour or so the light will be quite gone. Suppose we had come on this in the dark." We had not found the path we were seeking. We did not seek it any more. Abruptly we turned right and began to walk into the moor. So long as we could see, we kept the coast behind our backs. Soon we could not see at all. The night came on, impenetrably black, and there would be no moon. It was now 6 o'clock. I know that because I struck a match to look at the time, and I noticed that I had only 3 matches left. This is stuck in my mind because I said, we must be careful with these. If we can't find food, we'll find a smoke of comfort. But, my love, said Ruth, and there was now an undoubted note of alarm in her voice. We must find food. Surely if we just keep on, we'll see a light, or hear a voice, or come to a road. She stopped abruptly, seized my arm, held on to prevent my going forward. I could not see her face, but I sensed her alarm. What is it? I asked. I stepped in water. I knelt and tested the ground in front of me with my hands. It was a deep, oozy wetness, not the clear wetness of running water. Bog, I said, and we knew we could go forward no longer. With Cliff on the one hand and the possibility of stumbling into a morass on the other, there seemed nothing for it but to stay where we were till heaven sent us aid, or the dawn came up. I put my arm round Ruth and felt that she was trembling. I want to put this adventure down exactly as it happened. It would be nice to write that her nerves were steady as rock. Clearly they weren't, and I was not feeling very good either. I said, as gaily as I could, this is where we sit down, smoke a cigarette, and think it out. We went back a little so as to be away from the bog, and then we plumped down among the heather. We put the cigarettes to our lips, and I struck a match. It did not go out when I threw it to the ground. In that world of darkness, the little light burning on the earth drew our eyes, and simultaneously we both stood up with an exclamation of surprised delight. The light had shown us an inscribed stone, almost buried in the heather. There were 2 matches left. Fortunately, we were tidy people. We had put our sandwich papers into the rucksacks. I screwed these now into little torches. Ruth lit one and held it to the stone, while I knelt to read. It seemed a stone of fabulous age. The letters were mossy and at first illegible. I took out a penknife and scraped at them. 2 miles, we made out. But the name of this place 2 miles off, we do not know to this day. I scraped away, but the letters were too defaced for reading, and just as the last of the little torches flared to extinction, the knife slipped from my hand into the heather, and there was nothing to do but leave it there. We stood up. 2 miles, but 2 miles to where and 2 miles in what direction? Our situation seemed no happier. When suddenly I saw the stones. I had seen stones like them on the Yorkshire moors, round about the old Bronte parsonage. Were they the same sort of stones, and did they mean the same thing? I was excited now. Stay here, I said to Ruth, and I stepped towards the first stone. As I had hoped, a third came into view in line with the second, and as I advanced, a fourth in line with the third. They were the same, upright monoliths set to mark a path, whitewashed halfway up so they would glimmer through the dark as they were doing now, tarred on their upper half to show the way when the snow was on the ground. I shouted in my joy, "Come on! Supper, fires, comfort, salvation!" But Ruth came gingerly. She had not forgotten the bog. But the stones did not let us down. They led us to the village. It must have been about 9 o'clock when we got there. Halfway through that pitch-black 2-mile journey, we were aware that once more we were approaching the sea. From afar we could hear its uneasy murmur growing louder, and presently threaded with a heart-darkening sound, the voice of a bellboy tolling its insistent warning out there on the unseen water. As the murmur of the sea and the melancholy clangour of the bell came clearer, we went more warily, for we could not see more than the stone next ahead, and presently there was no stone where the next stone should be. We peered into the darkness, our hearts aching for the light which would tell us that we were again among houses and men. There was no light anywhere. "We have one match," I said. "Let us light a cigarette apiece and chance seeing something that will help us." We saw the wire hawser, no more than the veriest scrap of it, fixed by a great staple into the head of a post and slanting down into darkness. I first, Ruth behind me. We got our hands upon it, gripping for dear life, and went inching down towards the sound of water. So we came at last to the village. Like many a Cornish village, it was built at the head of a cove. The sea was in front, there was a horseshoe of cliffs, and snuggling at the end was a half-moon of houses behind a sea wall of granite. All this did not become clear to us at once. For the moment we had no other thought than of thankfulness to be treading on hard cobbles that had been laid by human hands. No other desire than to bang on the first door and ask whether there was in the place an inn or someone who would give us lodging for the night. Most of the cottages were whitewashed. Their glimmer gave us the rough definition of the place, and I think already we must have felt some uneasy presage at the deathly mask of them. White as skulls, with no light in their eyes. For there was no living person, no living thing in the village. That was what we discovered. Not so much as a dog went by us in the darkness. Not so much as a cock crowed. The tolling from the water came in like a passing bell, and the sea whispered incessantly, and grew to a deep-throated, threatening roar as the tide rose, and billows beat on the sand, and at last on the sea wall. But there was no one to notice these things except ourselves, and our minds were almost past caring, so deeply were we longing for one thing only: the rising of the sun. There was nothing wrong with the village. It contained all the apparatus of living. Bit by bit we discovered that. There was no answer to our knocking at the first door we came to. There was nothing remarkable in that. We went on to the next. Here again there was no welcome sound of feet, no springing up of a light to cheer us who had wandered for so long in the darkness. At the third house I knocked almost angrily. Yes, anger was the feeling I had then. Anger at all these stupid people who shut down a whole village at 9 o'clock, went to their warm beds and left us standing there, knocking in the cold and darkness. I thudded the knocker with lusty rat-a-tat, and suddenly, in the midst of that noisy assault, I stopped, afraid. The anger was gone. Plain fear took its place. At the next house, I could not knock, because I knew there was no one to hear me. I was glad to hear Ruth's voice. She said, surprisingly, "It's no good knocking. Try a door." And I turned the handle, and the door opened. Ruth and I stepped over the threshold, standing very close together. I shouted, "Is there anyone at home?" My voice sounded brutally loud and defiant. Nothing answered it. We were standing in the usual narrow passageway of a cottage. Ruth put out her hand and knocked something to the floor from a little table. "Matches," she said, and I groped on the floor and found them. The light showed us a hurricane lantern standing on the table. I lit it, and we began to examine the house, room by room. This was a strange thing to do, but at the time it did not seem strange. We were shaken and off our balance. We wanted to reassure ourselves. If we had found flintlocks, bows and arrows, bronze hammers, we might have been reassured. We could have told ourselves that we had wandered, bewitched, out of our century. But we found nothing of the sort. We found a spotless cottage, full of contemporary things. There was a wireless set. There was last week's Falmouth packet. There were geraniums in a pot in the window. There were sea boots and oilskins in the passage. The bed upstairs was made, and there was a cradle beside it. But there was no one in the bed, and no child in the cradle. Ruth was white. "I want to see the pantry," she said, inconsequentially, I thought. We found the pantry, and she took the cloth off a bread pan and put her hand upon a loaf. "It's warm," she said. "It was baked today." She began to tremble. We left the house and took the lantern with us. Slowly, with the bell tolling endlessly, we walked through the curved length of the village. There was one shop. I held up the light to its uncurtained window. Toys and sweets, odds and ends of grocery, all the stock in trade of a small general store were there behind the glass. We hurried on. We were hurrying now, quite consciously hurrying, though where we were hurrying to we did not know. Once or twice I found myself looking back over my shoulder. If I had seen man, woman or child, I think I should have screamed. So powerfully had the death of the village taken hold of my imagination that the appearance of a lived being, recently so strongly desired, would have affected me like the return of one from the dead. At the centre of the crescent of houses there was an inn, the Lobster Pot, with climbing geraniums ramping over its front in the way they do in Cornwall. Then came more cottages, and at the farther tip of the crescent there was a house standing by itself. It was bigger than any of the others. It stood in a little garden. In the comforting daylight I should have admired it as the sort of place some writer or painter might choose for a refuge. Now I could make it out only bit by bit, flashing the lantern here and there. And, shining the light upon the porch, I saw that the door was open. Ruth and I went in. Again I shouted, "Is anyone here?" Again I was answered by nothing. I put the lantern down on an oak chest in the small square hall, and that brought my attention to the telephone. There it was, standing on the chest, an up-to-date microphone in ivory white. Ruth saw it at the same moment, and her eyes asked me, "Do you dare?" Well, I did. I took up the microphone and held it to my ear. I could feel at once that it was dead. I joggled the rest. I shouted, "Hello? Hello?" But I knew that no one would answer. No one answered. We had stared through the windows of every cottage in the village. We had looked at the shop and the inn. We had banged at 3 doors and entered 2 houses. But we had not admitted our extraordinary situation in words. Now I said to Ruth, "What do you make of it?" She said simply, "It's worse than ghosts. Ghosts are something. This is nothing. Everything is absolutely normal. And that's what seems so horrible." And indeed, a village devastated by fire, flood, or earthquake would not have disturbed us as we were disturbed by that village which was devastated by nothing at all. Ruth shut the door of the hall. The crashing of the sea on granite, the tolling of the bell now seemed far off. We stood and looked at one another uneasily in the dim light of the hurricane lamp. "I shall stay here," said Ruth, "either till the morning or till something happens." She moved down the hall to a door which opened into a room at the back. I followed her. She tapped on the door, but neither of us expected an answer, and there was none. We went in. Nothing that night surprised us like what we saw then. Holding the lantern high above my head, I swung its light round the room. It was a charming place, panelled in dark oak. A fine few pictures were on the walls. There were plenty of books, some pieces of good porcelain, The curtains of dark green velvet fringed with gold were drawn across the window. A fire was burning on the hearth. That was what made us start back almost in dismay. The fire. Or if it had been a peat fire, one of those fires that once lit smoulder for days, we should have not been surprised. But it was not. Anyone who knew anything about fires could see that this fire had been lit within the last hour. Some of the coals were still black. None had been consumed. And the light from this fire fell upon the white smooth texture of an excellent linen cloth upon the table. On the table was supper, set for one. A chair was placed before the knife and fork and plates. There was a round of cold beef waiting to be cut, a loaf of bread, a jar of pickles, a fine cheese, a glass, and a jug containing beer. Ruth laughed shrilly, and I could hear that her nerves were strained by this last straw. "Huh, at least we shan't starve," she cried. "I'm nearly dying of hunger. I suppose the worst that could happen would be the return of the bears, demanding, 'Who's been eating my beef? Who's been drinking my beer? Sit down. Carve.'" No, I was as hungry as she was. As I looked at the food, the saliva flowed in my mouth, but I could as soon have touched it as robbed a poor box. And Ruth knew it. She turned from the table, threw herself into an easy chair by the fire, and lay back, exhausted. Her eyes closed. I stood behind the chair and stroked her forehead till she slept. That was the best that could happen to her. That, in a way, was the end of our adventure. Nothing more happened to us. Nothing more. But as you see, nothing at all had happened to us. And it was this nothingness that made my vigil over Ruth sleeping in the chair the most nerve-destroying experience of all my life. A clock, ticking away quietly on the chimney-piece, told me that it was 9:30. A tear-off calendar lying on a writing table told me that it was December 24th. Quite correct. All in order. The hurricane lamp faded and went out. I lit a lamp shaded with green silk that stood on the table amid the waiting supper. The room became cosier, even more human and likeable. I prowled about quietly, piecing together the personality of the man or woman who lived in it. A man. It was a masculine sort of supper, and I found a tobacco jar and a few pipes. The books were excellently bound editions of the classics, with one or two modern historical works. The pictures I saw now were Medici reprints of French Impressionists, all save the one over the fireplace, which was an original by Paul Nash. I tried, with these trivial investigations, to divert my mind from the extraordinary situation we were in. It wouldn't work. I sat down and listened intently, but there was nothing to hear save the bell and the water. Water that stretched, I reminded myself. From here to America, this was one of the ends of the world. At one point, I got up and locked the door. Though what was there to keep out? All that was to be feared was inside me. The fire burned low, and there was nothing for its replenishment. It was nearly gone, and the room was turning cold, when Ruth stirred and woke. At that moment the clock, which had a lovely silver note, struck 12. "A Merry Christmas, my darling," I said. Ruth looked at me wildly, taking some time to place herself. Then she laughed and said, "I've been dreaming about it. It's got a perfectly natural explanation. It was like this. Oh, no, it's gone. I can't remember it. But it was something quite reasonable." I sat with my arm about her. "My love," I said, "I can think of 100 quite reasonable explanations. For example, Every man in the village for years has visited his Uncle Henry at Bodmin on Christmas Eve, taking wife, child, dog, cat and canary with him. The chap in this house is the only one who hasn't got an Uncle Henry at Bodmin. So he laid the supper, lit the fire, and was just settling down for the evening when the landlord of the Lobster Pot thought he'd be lonely, looked in and said, "What about coming to see my Uncle Henry at Bodmin?" And off they all went. That's perfectly reasonable. It explains everything. Do you believe it? Ruth shook her head. "You must sleep," she said. "Lay your head on my shoulder." We left the house at 7 o'clock on Christmas morning. It was slack tide. The sea was very quiet, and in the grey light, standing in the garden at the tip of the crescent, we could see the full extent of the village with one sweep of the eye, as we had not been able to do last night. It was a lovely little place, huddled under the rocks at the head of its cove. Every cottage was well cared for, newly washed in cream or white, and on one or two of them a few stray roses were blooming, which is not unusual in Cornwall at Christmas. At any other time, Ruth and I would have said, "Let's stay here." But now we hurried, rucksacks on backs, disturbed by the noise of our own shoes, and climbed the path down which we had so cautiously made our way the night before. There were the stones of black and white. We followed them till we came to the spot where we found the stone with the obliterated name. And behold, there was no stone there, but your lost pocket knife was lying in the heather, said a sceptical friend to whom I once related this story. That, I suppose, would be a good way to round off an invented tale if I were a professional storyteller. But in simple fact, the stone was there, and so was my knife. Ruth took it from me, and when we came to the place where we had left the cliff path and turned into the moor, she held it far out, and we heard the faint tinkle of its fall on the rocks below. "And now," she said with resolution, "we go back the way we came, and we eat our Christmas dinner in Falmouth. Then you can inquire for the first train to Manchester. Didn't you say there are fogs there?" "There are and all," I said broadly. "Good," said Ruth. "After last night, I feel a fog is something substantial. Something you can get hold of." Today's story was Christmas Honeymoon by Howard Spring. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I very much hope you enjoyed that, and until next time, sweet dreams.